watchers today are very familiar with Marxism, the variant forms of Marxism, whether it has to do with social justice, whether it has to do with socialism, whether it has to do with full-blown communism. There are variant forms of Marxist ideology at work in our country and in different parts of the world. You have some countries like China, that is a communist country. North Korea is a communist country. We all remember the Soviet Union before it fell at the end of the Cold War was, again, a full-blown communist country. Down in Cuba, Fidel Castro was a communist. All over Africa, you have communism at work. If you listen to the Christians down in South Africa today, South Africa that's been turned upside down with the anti-apartheid movement, they will tell you that communism is ultimately what undermined what was once a very thriving country in South Africa. Now the country is in decline. The Christians down there are being killed continually by the followers of Nelson Mandela, who was a communist. Why are all these things happening in different parts of the world? And what does it have to do with the Jesuit order? To answer that question, I want to begin by reading from a book that was published back in 1881. Mark the date, 1881. Long before the Communist Revolution in Russia, long before the Communist Revolution in China, long before communism took over North Korea or Cuba, or any of the other countries in modern times that are under communist rule. Long before. Remember, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. That's the date. The Communist Manifesto, which is typically seen as the foundation of communism. Now, what we're going to learn in this 2-disc audio CD is we're going to learn that communism, the principles of communism, which is essentially government-organized theft. Theft on behalf of alleged humanitarian equality. In a nutshell, that's what it is. Whereby governing powers come in, and the argument is, of course, that you have inequality, and that you have the establishment people, they have all the money. Then you have other people who don't have as much money, and so the communists come in, and their argument is that they are going to equalize everything. And of course, in order for them to equalize everything, they will have to seize control of the country. They'll have to seize control of the economy. They'll have to seize control of the government, everything. And then once they're in control of everything, they will be the equalizers. They'll make sure everybody has an equal portion, supposedly. Now, of course, anybody who knows the history of communism knows that that's not ultimately what happens. What happens in any communist or socialist country is that you're going to end up with an elite class that operates at the upper level. They're going to have all the power. And really the equality is that everybody else in society is pushed down into a lower station, and they are all given an equal portion of oppression and misery. And once you understand these principles and you understand where they came from, you'll see that long before Karl Marx ever wrote his book, The Communist Manifesto, or any other writings, the principles involved in communism can be traced all the way to Rome. And in particular, those principles were developed by the Jesuit order, I believe, as part of the Counter-Reformation. Now, for the benefit of anyone listening who may not be familiar with exactly what the Counter-Reformation is, the Great Reformation happened beginning with Luther in 1517, and then you had many of the countries of Western Europe that turned away from the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. They declared the Pope was Antichrist. They preached the gospel of grace, published the Bible in the languages of the common people, and the empire of the Pope, which is really the empire of the Inquisition, was dismantled. But then in 1540, the Pope commissioned a former Spanish general who was then a Catholic priest named Ignatius Loyola, who founded a company called the Society of Jesus that would become known as the Jesuits. The Jesuits would then launch what is called the Counter-Reformation, the purpose of which was to overturn the Protestant Reformation and reclaim all the territories that were lost by the papacy in the Middle Ages. That's it in a nutshell. And to effect their aims, they developed many methods. Especially they got involved in education, in schools, colleges, universities, and I believe they developed Marxism ultimately as a weapon. But the Jesuits essentially, as part of the counter-reform, took the principles that were employed by the Roman Catholic Church, by ancient Catholic writers like Thomas Aquinas, took those principles, reworked them, removed the elements of God and Roman Catholicism from them, stripped them down to a very secular form, really a militant atheist form, and then began to employ them as a weapon in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. Now, looking at this work from 1881 by the 19th century historian James Atkin Wylie, J.A. Wylie, a very prominent 19th century Protestant historian who wrote a number of books warning about Rome and the Jesuits in particular. This work is titled The Jesuits, Their Moral Maxims and Plots. The Jesuits, Their Moral Maxims and Plots. The full title, there's a long title for it, which is The Jesuits, Their Moral Maxims and Plots Against Kings, Nations, and Churches, by the Reverend J.A. Wylie, author of The History of Protestantism. And of course, if you really want to learn the history of Protestantism from a Protestant perspective prior to the 20th century, which is going to be much more accurate than what they're teaching today, I highly recommend Wylie's 4-volume set on the history of Protestantism. But let's talk about what he says in this book on the Jesuits on page 102. He says this, where he talks about the Jesuits and communism. He says, quote, "There is another cloud hanging over us, and not us only, but over all Christendom. We refer to the steady growth of communism and other forms of political and social revolution in all the countries of continental Europe. We had the fact publicly proclaimed to us as one of startling and ominous significance by an able and experienced diplomatist at the recent meeting of the Social Science Association in Edinburgh. Communism, said that authority, is the reason of the enormous armies maintained at this day by the continental governments. And we were warned, moreover, that in the presence of so formidable a foe, daily growing in numbers and strength, not one of these governments dare reduce their overgrown armaments. If these governments will return to their obedience to the See of Rome, the Jesuits will exert themselves to the utmost to extinguish communism and make all safe and stable around the thrones which it menaces with overthrow." Then he goes on. He says, quote, "But if these governments shall maintain their present attitude to the Vatican, if they persist in declining the concordats and canon law of Rome, they will be left to reckon with the communists as best they may. Help from the papal see they shall have none. Nay, the Jesuits in the end of the day will make common cause with communism, and will use this new-sprung force to wreak their vengeance on those governments which have lifted up the heel against their liege lord and obstinately refuse to return to their obedience to a ruler who claims to be the moral and political sovereign of all Christendom, the king of all its kings." And of course, within the Jesuitical context, that is a reference very clearly to the Pope. That is what Wylie means by their liege lord. He says, to a ruler who claims to be the moral and political sovereign of all Christendom, the king of all its kings. That is what the popes claimed through the Middle Ages. Now, in modern times, you don't hear this kind of rhetoric being used about the Pope or the papacy in general. It's not used that way because the world is different now and people wouldn't receive that well, mainly because of the changes in the Protestant Reformation are brought about because of Protestantism. But I want you to take note of one thing before we continue with this. Take note of what Wylie said earlier when he says if these governments will return to their obedience to the See of Rome. In other words, if they turn now and just like in the Middle Ages prior to the Reformation, if they'll repent from their Protestant Reformed worldview and go back to obeying the Pope and the Holy See, and I'm saying, I'm assuming there that he's talking mainly about Protestant countries that were once part of the Holy Roman Empire, but this would also probably include Catholic countries that adopted certain of the reforms of Protestantism so they would have greater freedom. And it's important to remember that historians tell us that the Jesuits were kicked out of the countries of Europe more than 40 times in the Middle Ages, and many of these were Catholic countries. And why? Most likely because they were manipulating them, trying to force them to go along with a certain agenda that the Jesuits had that they didn't necessarily want to obey. So, but notice what he says. He says, if they will return and obey the Pope, he says, if that is the case, then, quote, the Jesuits will exert themselves to the utmost to extinguish communism and make all safe and stable around the thrones which it menaces with overthrow. Now think about that for a minute. He's talking about the Jesuits and communism as if they have the power to put a stop to the spread of communism. Somehow or other, the kings don't have necessarily the ability to stop communism, but the Jesuits do. Why? I remember during the Reagan administration, when Pope John Paul II came to Washington and met with President Reagan, and it was said that Pope John Paul II and President Reagan worked together and brought down the wall and put an end to Soviet communism. And how was that the case? Is it possible that the same people who put up the wall, the Berlin Wall, were the same people who brought it down? Is that why? Once the Vatican got involved, wow, what do you know? The Berlin Wall comes down and Soviet communism comes to an end in Russia. Very interesting. But Wylie goes, he's clearly talking about it as though the Jesuits have the ability to control communism. If they have the ability to restrain it, then obviously they're exercising some kind of control over it. If they have the ability to stop it in such a way that they're going to make everything safe and sound around the throne. But then he goes on and he says that in the end of the day, they will make common cause with communism. And effectively, he says, will use this new sprung force to wreak their vengeance on those governments that basically resist the Pope. This would be my chief reason for arguing that communism was developed ultimately as a weapon of the Counter-Reformation, because this is how Wylie describes it. But there's even more evidence beyond all of this. We're going to go over some more of what he says about the Vatican here, but then we're going to go into other areas of history and other sources just beyond Wylie himself and see how the Jesuits developed the principles of communism in what were called the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay. And of course, you can find history books that talk about this as well. But what is the ultimate ambition? The ultimate ambition. Well, Wylie goes on. And again, remember, this is 1881. He says, last of all, there comes a warning from the Vatican. Not later than the 24th of October last, The present Pope, who has been so lauded for moderation, found it in him to deliver himself on the question of the temporal power. That's earthly political power. That's temporal power. Although Pius IX had risen from the dead, his words would not have been more stout. Leo XIII claims that whole temporal princedom over Italy and over Christendom, that is all Christian countries, over Christendom, which Pius IX, in so many allocutions, and most solemnly and irrevocably of all, in the syllabus, claimed as the rightful prerogative of his chair. Moreover, Leo warns us that he will never rest till he has conquered what he accounts his rightful position. This is a declaration of war against Italy in the first place and against all the governments of Christendom in the second. It is a declaration of war on the part of a king whose million host, outnumbering 10 times the army of any other monarch, stretches from side to side of Europe, phalanx upon phalanx, and waits with no little impatience the hour when communism, grown strong and weighing down Germany, the great powers embroiled in the Eastern question, and Great Britain caught in the straits of a great war, the word shall go forth, and the papal host swelled by communists. Right? Get this now. The papal host swelled by communists, atheists, and the multitudinous foes of established order will open a conflict with Christianity and liberty all round the world. So notice what Wylie says at 1881, brethren. 1881. You look at the situation in the world today with the Vatican that very clearly advances and supports the leftist agenda. There's no question. Globalism, open borders, the principles of communism have been supported by the Vatican in a variety of ways for the last 100 years. Once you know the history, once you know what's really going on. Yes, there are periods where it seems like the Vatican opposes communism, but we have to wonder if those periods are really a kind of posturing that went on for a period of time. We have politicians in our own government that do this. They pretend that they're against something when they're not really against it. All right, so summing up this chapter where Wylie talks about, and just so you know, throughout this book, Wylie talks about the Jesuits in a variety of different ways. His chapter where he mentions communism encompasses a small part of it, but he makes it very clear his belief that they're using, or that they were using back in the 19th century, communism as a weapon. But then he gives this warning about the Jesuits in general. He says, this gives added significance to the question of the admission of the Jesuits into Great Britain. Admit the plague if you will. It will make many a corpse. It will dig many a grave and call forth on the highway the mournful pomp of many a funeral procession. But a few years will pass, and again the merry laugh of boyhood and girlhood will be heard on our streets. And then he says, but let the Jesuit enter, and it will be the dread spectacle seen by the apocalyptist when he beheld, and lo, a pale horse, and he that sat on him was death, and hell followed with him. It is not the bodies of its living men merely that the Jesuits will trample into the grave. It is the manhood, the virtue, the patriotism, the piety of the land which he will waste and trample down. All that is lovely and noble and good will wither and die under the sirocco breath of Jesuitism. And the word sirocco there, S-I-R-O-C-C-O, is a reference to like a hot wind, the sirocco breath of Jesuitism, right? A pretty powerful warning. pretty powerful warning. He then says, if then our law cannot or will not give us protection, it becomes only the more our duty by unmasking the principles and arts of the order. Now, there's a number of elements here that I find really fascinating when I study the warnings of J.A. Wylie, when he talks about how it's not just dead bodies that the Jesuits will be responsible for, it's the manhood, the virtue, and the patriotism and the piety of the land. Think about that. Trampling down the manhood. How has the manhood of America and the Western world been affected? By the promotion of the homosexual movement and transgenderism and all this other kind of stuff, which I've warned people for years, the Jesuits have been pushing the gay agenda since the 1970s. There's even a documentary about their work promoting the LGBT movement. You can look for a Jesuit named John McNeil, who wrote a book years ago called The Church and the Homosexual. All of this is a part of what they call cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism, the idea of trying to make all things equal. So they take something like homosexuality and transgenderism and they try to equalize it in the culture. And they say, well, you've got to give equality to these people, etc. But what does it do? It has systematically assaulted the whole idea of manhood in our country and the Western world, so that men are weakened, they're effeminized. All right, so trample down manhood, the virtue, the morality of society. Look at what's happened since the explosion of the sexual revolution and the normalization of immoral practices. That is part of what assails the Western world. The manhood, the virtue, the patriotism. They're going to attack the concept of patriotism. Think about people in our country trampling on the American flag, insulting America. If you read all of Wylie's book, these are all tactics that the Jesuits employ in different countries. Whenever they want to break them down, they'll attack the patriotism of that country and try to demoralize the country, insult your history, insult everything about your national heritage. And who are the ones doing it? Who's behind it? It's these radical leftists, your radical Marxists, the same people who are marching out on the street, holding up signs for socialism, and we've even seen some holding up full-blown communist flags. These are the people trying to trample down all of these elements of virtue, patriotism, manhood, and as Wylie says, all that is lovely and noble and good. He says, all that is lovely and noble and good will wither and die as a result of Jesuitism. That's his warning. He's basically saying it would be better for a country to have a plague that comes in, kills a certain number of people, then you move on and you get over it. But once the Jesuits come in, they infect your entire system, your entire culture, your politics, your education, the whole thing, and they turn it upside down. It is exactly what has happened to our system in the United States. It's what's happened to the systems of the countries of the Western world. And collectively, people understand it as Marxism. What most people don't realize is that what the Marxists are doing, all of the tactics that they employ, were tactics employed for hundreds of years by the Jesuit order, all as part of the Counter-Reformation. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Marxism and Jesuitism are virtually one and the same thing. And to take this a step further, just to prove the point, this is not certainly the first time in history that somebody like me has made this assertion. When Marxism was on the rise in the days of Karl Marx back in the 19th century, this assertion was made by others. In fact, Otto von Bismarck in Germany believed that the Jesuits were in league with Karl Marx. And of course, Karl Marx himself was educated at a secularized Jesuit high school when he was a young man for a number of years. So you have a quote back in 1879 in the Chicago Tribune. There's actually an interview that was done with Karl Marx back then in the 19th century. But if you look up this article, Chicago Tribune, January 5th, 1879, at one point during the interview, Karl Marx himself said that Bismarck, he says, quote, Bismarck complained in his North German Gazette that I was in league with Father Beck, the leader of the Jesuit movement, and that we were keeping the socialist movement in such a condition that he could do nothing with it. End quote. Now, just to clarify, Marx in this quote in the article is actually brushing off the assertion that he's in league with the Jesuits. That's what he's doing, just so we understand. He's brushing it off, trying to suggest that Otto von Bismarck is making this assertion, but there's nothing to it. Of course, we've seen those kind of denials even here in modern times when people have said that Barack Obama, for example, was a closet Muslim and this kind of thing, and Obama would brush it off. So we've seen this kind of thing before. But Otto von Bismarck, who was the leader of Germany, took this whole situation with the Jesuits so seriously, and apparently with Marx so seriously as well, that he expelled the Jesuits from Germany. They were expelled from the country. In fact, you can read about this from a number of different sources. And here I'll just read from an article on von Bismarck that you could find on Wikipedia. It says, quote, Bismarck believed that the Pope and bishops held too much power over the German Catholics and was further concerned about the emergence of the Catholic Center Party organized in 1870. Now, the Catholic Center Party is very important because it would be the Catholic Center Party that in the 20th century would be responsible for giving Adolf Hitler his absolute authority. If you study the book Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell, Cornwell says that Cardinal Pacelli, who would become Pope Pius XII, i.e. Hitler's Pope, that Pacelli had continually tried to broker a deal with Germany to get a concordat with Germany. And he had all of these German leaders that turned him down. Finally, when Hitler got to power, he said yes, and a concordat was signed between Germany and the Vatican. That concordat continues right up to this day. It's still in effect. But in return for signing the concordat, Pope Pius directed Catholics in Germany to support Hitler, and in particular the Catholic Center Party gave Hitler, they voted to give Hitler absolute authority in government. That's why Hitler had the totalitarian power that he did. Now, after the war, after World War II, this is important as well, the Catholic Center Party sort of broke up, but it reinvented itself. Most of its members went on to form or to become members of another party called the Christian Democratic Union, the CDU, Christian Democratic Union. And today, the chairperson over the Christian Democratic Union is Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel, the current Chancellor of Germany. So you see the legacy has gone on from World War II. It's sort of, again, the same powers that were behind, that were working with the Vatican, that were behind Hitler during World War II, sort of, shifted around. And now today they are still in charge of Germany through Angela Merkel. And of course, everybody knows what Merkel is doing with bringing in more and more of these Muslim migrants and so on, despite all of the objections that she's getting from the population and despite all the turmoil that's been caused. Now, just to go back to Hitler's Nazi Germany, what was Nazism? It was the National Socialist Workers' Party. It was socialism. It was a socialist form of government. So it was a 20th century manifestation of a Marxist system. Now, it's important to remember that even within those who hold to Marxist ideologies, you have people who have their own ideas about it. They branch off. This is why Germany, that was with National Socialism, was at odds with Russia, that was a communist country, and so on. So they don't necessarily get along, but they're all using the same principles, or at least their understanding of those principles. Here in America, you've got Bernie Sanders, and he's calling himself a democratic socialist. He's got his own brand, his own blend of socialism. That's really what's happened to the Democratic Party here in the United States. They are representing their own version of what they think socialism ought to be. But the core principles can be traced back to not only the Jesuits, but back to the Church of Rome even before the Jesuits were formed. These principles we're going to see as we move on, these were the principles that governed the Dark Age. These are the same principles, but we'll see that as we move forward. Okay, so just to finish this quote, going back here for a moment to Otto von Bismarck, they're very interesting. There is a political cartoon from 1875 that shows the Pope at that time playing chess with Otto von Bismarck. And from 1875 it says, between Berlin and Rome, Bismarck left, confronts the Pope. That was a political cartoon from the time. It was seen that there was a struggle here. The importance of Germany is that the king of Germany through the Middle Ages was typically the Holy Roman Emperor, going all the way back to Charlemagne. That was usually the case. That's why Germany is so significant to the Vatican and their dream of reclaiming the Holy Roman Empire. All right, now I want to go back for a moment to the issue of what was going on in Germany with Otto von Bismarck. Remember, von Bismarck believed that the Jesuits were in league with Karl Marx, in particular Father Bex, who was the Jesuit general at the time. And here I'm going to read a quote from the book, The Jesuits and Globalization, Historical Legacies and Contemporary Challenges by Thomas Banchoff and Jose Casanova. Banchoff and Casanova. And this is just a quote from their book. Quote, in the German context, the Jesuits were critical of Otto von Bismarck's German unification drive in 1870-71 under Prussian and therefore Protestant leadership. Bismarck expelled the Jesuits from Germany in 1872, and the Kulturkampf, or Culture War, against Catholic influence in the 1880s featured a propaganda campaign against the Society of Jesus that painted it as a subversive alien force determined to weaken the German nation. All right, so that's just a quote about the expulsion of the Jesuits from Germany by Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century. And remember, it was Bismarck, according to Marx himself, who said in this interview, just to remind everybody, this interview in the Chicago Tribune in 1879, Marx said that, quote, Bismarck complained in his North German Gazette that I was in league with Father Beck, the leader of the Jesuit movement. Now, if you look up Father Beck, for some reason, in the online edition that they have of the Chicago Tribune, they spell the name of Father Beck, B-E-C-K. However, if you look up this Father Beck, his name is actually spelled Bex, B-E-C-K-X. B-E-C-K-X. And this is a reference to Peter Jan Bex, B-E-C-K-X. Again, Peter Jan, and Jan is spelled J-A-N. If you look up Bex, he was a Belgian Jesuit priest. He had been elected the 22nd Superior General of the Society of Jesus in 1853. So he was the Jesuit superior during this time of Karl Marx. If you go read about Peter Jan Bex, he's considered one of the most influential Jesuit black popes anywhere in history. And he's probably the single most influential in terms of pushing the order into the modern era. And he did a lot of this, a lot of his influence in the 19th century, from what I gather reading up on him. Anyway, Bex is the guy who is associated here with Karl Marx. Now, again, this is not just, I've often talked about how in modern times, Christian pastors and ministers will often speak about, or they'll speak against theories, conspiracy theories and this kind of thing. If you study history, you have people, the reformers would be called conspiracy theorists. The American revolutionaries would be called conspiracy theorists. At this point, you've got Otto von Bismarck, who believed that Karl Marx was conspiring with the Jesuit general and that they were using socialism together to undermine Germany. Now, if you go read up on Father Bex in the 19th century, there is an article on Wikipedia where they assemble a lot of information. It says at one point, it says, quote, "Those were difficult years for the Jesuits. They were expelled from Spain in 1854 and 1858, from Naples, Sicily in 1859, from Germany, 1872, we just talked about, from France and French colonies in 1880, and even from Rome itself in 1873, during which time Bex shifted his headquarters at Fiesole near Florence, where the Curia Generalizia remained until 1895. Okay, so notice they're being expelled from all of these different countries during this time period. Now, why are they being expelled? You can go read a bunch of different articles. They talk about how they were simply not trusted in all these different countries. They were expelled from Spain repeatedly in the 19th century. You go look up what was going on in Spain. In fact, there is a book called Concerning Jesuits. Concerning Jesuits, that's the title of the book, and it was published in 1902. 1902. And in that book, it talks about, it says they were expelled from Spain then. The Jesuits were expelled for 5 years, 1820 to 1825, for 9 more from 1835 to 1844, again 1854 and 1858, again in 1868. Okay, so just from one country, from Spain, they're being repeatedly expelled over and over again. And there were other countries who did the same. Not covered here is their expulsion from Switzerland, for example, back in the 19th century. And you could read about that from a variety of different sources. This is a quote from the New American Cyclopedia from 1862. It talks about how in the year 1846, that in September of that year, a resolution declared the expulsion of the Jesuits from all Switzerland. It goes on to say that they then raised an army of nearly 100,000 men, resolved to execute the decree by force of arms. There was a brief resistance, if you read this article there, but it says ultimately the Council of War, the government of Lucerne, and the Jesuits fled, and all the 7 cantons submitted. So the Protestants there in Switzerland were determined to get the Jesuits out of Switzerland. This was, and notice, Spain was Catholic. Switzerland, the Protestants wanted this there in Switzerland. But my point is, in the 19th century, this is when Marxism is really being stirred up. You have J.A. Wylie in 1881 basically saying that the Jesuits are using Marxism and socialism and this kind of thing as a weapon, communism, he says, as a weapon to try and control countries that will not submit to the papacy. So it all fits together that countries were suspicious of the Jesuits. They didn't trust them. They saw these revolutionary activities that were being stirred up, and they traced them to the Jesuits over and over again and would just kick them out of their countries. Now, I believe there's an additional reason why, and it has to do with a publication that had come out, that had been published actually in the 1840s, that pertains also very directly to the Jesuits and communism, the development of communism. And this is from a work called The Jesuit Conspiracy, The Secret Plan of the Order. The Jesuit Conspiracy, The Secret Plan of the Order. And this was published by a former Jesuit initiate. It's called The Jesuit Conspiracy, The Secret Plan of the Order, Detected and Revealed by the Abate Leone. The Abate Leone, the Abbot Leone, and his full name is apparently Jacopo Leone. Jacopo Leone, who was a former Jesuit initiate, according to what he says in this work, and claims that he overheard certain conversations by Jesuit leaders while he was being trained, educated, undergoing the process of initiation through them. And so he set these things down. But his work got a certain amount of attention back in the 19th century and could very well have been a contributing factor to why so many different countries were suspicious of what the Jesuits were up to, because they had been banished back in 1773. Then they were brought back in 1814, 1815. And after their reinstatement in 1815, that's when you have the letter from John Adams to Thomas Jefferson where he says, I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. And he warns that we'll likely have swarms of them in America in more disguises than even a king of the gypsies could assume, Adams said. And then he says, I know of no body of men more deserving of eternal damnation on earth or in hell than these sons of Loyola. Words to that effect. I'm paraphrasing him a bit. But this is what John Adams said. Now remember, former president of the United States is writing this to another former president of the United States. So these are not just conspiracy theorists. These are leading figures in the world of politics, political leaders. And so my general impression of what was going on with the Jesuits through the 19th century, especially with the rise of Marxism and the association of the Jesuit general with Karl Marx, which was believed by Otto von Bismarck. You have leaders all over Europe and in America who are giving warnings about the Jesuit order and what was going on with them. And this undoubtedly, I think, contributed to the strong suspicions that people had of them in all these different countries, and it's why they were being expelled. But I think part of it also is this, in addition to all the other warnings being given, we have the publication in the 1840s. In fact, it was in the year 1848 that you have this book by the Abbot Leone that we've been talking about here. And I'll read you a quote, because the quote where they mention the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay, this you find in this quote here from 1848, and the reference to Paraguay is an indirect reference to their development of communism. But let's look at the whole quote. And here's what one of the Jesuit leaders is reported to have said, and this was recorded by Leone, who at the time was a Jesuit initiate. And he said this, he said, quote, the Jesuit leader said, quote, our weapons are of a quite different temper from those of the Caesars of all ages. We need fear no lack of soldiers. Only let us supply ourselves to recruiting them from all ranks and from all nations and drilling them into punctual service. You well know that what we aim at is the empire of the world. But how are we to succeed unless we have everywhere adepts who understand our language, which must yet remain unknown to others? Okay, now let's think. This is the first part of the quote. Think about what is being said here. He's saying we're not going to have any lack of soldiers, but we've got to recruit them from all ranks, from all the nations. Think about how communism has affected so many different countries, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, how it's affected parts of Africa, how it's affected Cuba. It's all these different countries. Why? Because the Roman Catholic Church has churches and missions and so on in all these different countries throughout the world. And he said at one point, you well know that what we aim at is the empire of the world. That is a declaration of globalism, all the way back in the 19th century. But how are we to succeed unless we have everywhere adepts who understand our language, which must yet remain unknown to others? Now, I would contend, when we see our young people coming out of the colleges and the universities where they are being indoctrinated with these Marxist ideas, think about what they're doing. They're coming out, they're making all of these outlandish declarations. They have these proclamations about things, about so-called rights and inequalities and this kind of thing, whether they're talking about misogyny or how trans lives matter, or open borders, or no one is illegal, etc. If you understand the direction of all this language, it all moves in the direction of pure communism. Pure communism. But it's like they have their own hidden language that they've learned somehow in these colleges and universities and schools and so on, that the rest of us we're listening to it, and it all just sounds completely crazy, like they're talking in a foreign language, a foreign tongue. And I believe my argument would be, my thesis would be, is that this is what's in view here, that the Jesuits, through the education system, indoctrinate young people to understand the language and the thought process that they desire. That's what's in view here. And notice it is something that is spread throughout much of the civilized world. So you've got one country after another that has been subverted by these ideas. Okay, so then he goes on, this Jesuit leader says, quote, "Doubtless you have not forgotten our ancient Paraguay." This is the reference to Paraguay, which we're going to talk more about. But Paraguay, it is said that the Jesuits, while they were in Paraguay, developed the specific principles of what would become communism through the 19th century. And they did it through their how they managed the Guarani Indians in these little communes. All right, so here's the full quote. "Doubtless you have not forgotten our ancient Paraguay. It was but a very limited trial of our system in a small corner of the globe. In these latter days we need a new code, we who have undertaken to work so mighty a change, to make everything bend beneath the irresistible hammer of our doctrines, so that all shall become as stone, iron, gold, and adamant for the gigantic building into which we will force all men to enter." End quote. Now, I would contend that what's being described there is what is often called globalism, a one-world order, or international communism. All right, but now let's talk about, again, let's go back to this issue of the ancient Paraguay, what they're talking about, the ancient Paraguay, and read about the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay. Now, this is from a very, very modern article from the Illinois State University. Illinois State University, Department of Family and Consumer Sciences, College of Applied Science and Technology. That's the whole big long title there. And they had an article titled "Behind the Klug Prize, the Mediated World of the Guarani." Guarani, Guarani. That is the name of the Guarani Indians that were governed by the Jesuits in Paraguay. And this, again, this is Illinois State University. Here's what they said about the Jesuit reductions of Paraguay. They said, quote, The reductions may be viewed as clinical sociology lab sites for a Jesuit New World Order. Now remember, this is not a conspiracy website. This is Illinois State University. The reductions may be viewed as clinical sociology lab sites for a Jesuit New World Order, which were administered by the Jesuit Superior General from Rome, overseen by his provincials, managed by his priests, and constructed by their Guarani subjects. Okay? In other words, they got the Guarani to actually build these communes and whatnot. It says, quote, as a preeminent method for mediating the social and cultural reality of human populations, the reductions exist today as a living research model for social and domestic scientists. Think about that. Social and domestic scientists. In other words, people who are involved in social engineering, like scientists, they're in a lab conducting experiments with things. And so this is social and domestic scientists. Here they are experimenting with population control and how to manipulate people, etc. I mean, this is really what communism and socialism is all about. How you can manipulate people's lives to supposedly make the world more efficient, better, etc. And certainly we all believe in good government, but the principle of American freedom and Christian freedom in particular is to minimize the influence of government, that government just upholds the moral boundaries of society, defends that which is good, and punishes and restrains that which is evil. That's the simple purpose for government. When the socialists get involved, and the Jesuits, they wish to control every aspect of life. Really, it is an obsession with controlling other people. That's what it is, an obsession with power. So, for social and domestic scientists, educators, and students interested in examining this lost history and studying any of the spiritual and temporal techniques, such as the ratio studorum, the plan of study, the Jesuits are famous for that, which is basically their education model. The ratio studorum of 1599, used by the order to achieve its infamous goal of returning all of the spiritual and political power on earth that was lost during the Protestant Reformation to the Vatican. End quote. Now remember something, brethren, this is not a conspiracy website. This is Illinois State University, the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences. And even they know, if they actually go, but notice what they mention here, examining this lost history. This can be said of a lot of information on the Jesuit order for the past 400 to 500 years. Not quite 500 years yet, but it's more than 400. But the order was officially commissioned in 1540. So it's been over 400 years that the Jesuits have been manipulating societies, been really experimenting. They are social and domestic scientists trying to figure out ways that they can control and manipulate populations. And that's really what cultural Marxism and Marxism in general is all about. It's why when you're seeing Marxists get into the education system and they use these methods, whether they're Jesuits or not, if they've learned these methods, it's important to understand these methods were developed by the Jesuits over a very long period of time, hundreds of years. And when these methods are employed, they're very, very effective. And as we've seen here in our own country more and more, they really drive people into madness. And they become like slaves, quite frankly. Now I'm going to read you another quote. And I want you to hear this quote, and it's based on a criticism of what the Jesuits were known to have done with the Guarani there in Paraguay. And I want you to think about this in terms of the impact of the Marxist educators across the country and what's happened to our young people. You know, I see all these interviews with young people, often college students and so on, and they'll ask them questions about history. You know, do they know who won the American Civil War? They have no idea. What was the American Revolution about? They have no idea. They'll be shown pictures of famous figures in history. They don't know who they are. Somehow or other, even though these are college students, they're sometimes at leading universities and so on, they've not been educated. They've been indoctrinated with these radical ideas, and they don't really know, it appears, how to think for themselves. Now, with that in view, and many of you have probably been following what goes on in the news and with independent media and so on, and you know what I'm talking about. Now, consider this quote from a book, a work called Colonization, a Study of the Founding of New Societies by Albert Galloway Keller. And this was published in the year 1908. 1908, early part of the 20th century, 1908, which I think is significant because they began to rewrite history books in 1920. All right, but here is what Keller says about the Jesuits in Paraguay. He says, quote, "What the Jesuits have been blamed for is that they made of their charges mere apes and parrots." And by the word charges there, the people that they were in charge of. That's what he means by that, the Guarani Indians. So he says, what the Jesuits have been blamed for is that they made of their charges mere apes and parrots, incapable of progress and invention if left to themselves. The old accusations against communism that it destroys emulation and individual initiative were lodged against the reduction. Again, the protests were directed against the rigorous seclusion policy, for in this the Paraguay Jesuits rivaled all other missionaries because they had the power to do so. They admitted no European, even within the bounds of their reductions. The critics of the Jesuits have regularly asserted to the inducing of a mental and moral imbecility in a group held in virtual servitude for ulterior ends. Okay? So notice the language that Keller is using here. Those who criticized what the Jesuits did, notice they admitted no European. Why? Probably because Europeans were more educated. They would have come in there and recognized that these people had been reduced to an inferior status. They probably would have objected to it. And word would have gotten back to Europe, and the Jesuits would have been more heavily criticized than they wanted to be. But this idea of keeping anybody who would be able to argue with what they were doing out, as I'm reading that, I think about what goes on in the colleges and the universities. If you have a conservative, for example, or a Christian, or somebody who's going to represent or to challenge the leftist worldview and come in there with traditional conservative or Bible-based Christian ideas and speak at many of these colleges and universities, what happens is there's a shouting match. The students are riled up. We've seen at Berkeley riots, smashing, burning, chasing people out. And of course, are the students getting this on their own? Or are they being stirred up to do this by their professors who are there in these colleges and so on? It's hard to say exactly how it's happening, but there's a pattern of this where they don't want outsiders to come in and tell them anything other than whatever indoctrination and brainwashing they have been given. And it's very similar to what was going on in these reductions. It was the same principles at work. Outsiders must be kept out. They can't come in there and somehow or other upset the status quo. But notice what Keller says. Made of their charges mere apes and parrots, incapable of progress and invention if left to themselves. In other words, they become reliant upon these totalitarian leaders, the Jesuits themselves. And you think about what's going on in our education system, where what they're doing to young people, I mean, we've even got stories now, what they're telling the young people, they're telling them not to believe that if you work hard, you will get ahead. And they're telling teachers not to tell students that America is the land of opportunity, and that if you work hard and if you're diligent, you can be successful. Because if you say that, then you are denying that the system is rigged and that it's based on, bigotry and all this other kind of stuff. And in order for the system to change, and by that they mean to make it a socialist system, in order for that to happen, it has to be acknowledged that there's all these inequalities and injustices and white privilege and on and on and on. All this Marxist dialogue. And what's happening is our young people, they don't know how to function in America. They have become, many of them, apes and parrots. That's what they are. The critics of the Jesuits, let me read this again. The critics of the Jesuits have regularly asserted to the inducing of a mental and moral imbecility in a group held in virtual servitude. You look at what many of our young people are doing. They're just out there shouting and screaming for this whole leftist agenda. And they're servitude for ulterior ends. That's what's happened in our education system. This represents the globalist agenda, because the globalist agenda is communism, worldwide communism. That's ultimately where it is headed. But going back to what we read from this quote from Illinois State University, when it's talking about the reductions and talking about the ratio studiorum, the plan of study, the education model of the Jesuits that they introduced in 1599. Because the way that they accomplish all of this, brethren, is through education, is through getting into the schools, having colleges, universities, etc. And we have at least 28 Jesuit colleges, for example, and universities here in the United States. In fact, you can go to their website at the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, ajcunet.edu. That's their website. And they will openly tell you part of their purpose is, quote, international education and support initiatives that advance global citizenship. This is all part of the globalist agenda of the Jesuit order. Exactly what we were reading in the book by Leone about what is their ambition? The empire of the world, they said. The empire of the world. And if you were to search a little bit further on the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities website, you could also read about their alumni, the Jesuit Alumni in Congress. They have currently 12 alumni in the United States Senate and 44 of their alumni in the House of Representatives. You've had important figures, people like John Boehner, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, John Brennan, former head of the CIA, who was in charge of the CIA during the Obama administration. And Barack Obama, of course, was his grassroots campaign was driven by a former Jesuit named Gregory Galuzzo, who even claimed responsibility for getting Obama into the White House. Then, of course, you had President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was educated at Georgetown University. Georgetown University is a Jesuit university. Now, with all of this in mind, let's go back again to this quote we read earlier from Illinois State University about the Jesuits and their ratio studiorum, the plan of study from 1599. What was the purpose? It says here that it was used by the order to achieve its infamous goal of returning all the spiritual and political power on earth that was lost during the Protestant Reformation to the Vatican. In other words, the Counter-Reformation. That's its goal. And the goal of its education programs is for that purpose. That's why I say Marxism is the weapon of the Counter-Reformation. All right, now I want to discuss a different dimension on this, because the question comes about, okay, if the Jesuits are behind this, why is it that Marxism tends to adopt a militant form of atheism? Why is that? Because throughout its history, there's no question, Marxists prefer militant, atheist, secular humanist ideology. But why? As we're going to learn when we get to the second audio CD, the principles of Marxism are actually taken from the Great Inquisition, which will make more sense here as we go forward. They were taken from the Great Inquisition, but they removed the elements of God and the church. And I believe the reason they did so was because the Jesuits, after having been driven out of many countries in Europe, many of those Catholic countries in the Middle Ages, they were abolished in 1773 by the Pope. The Pope abolished them, and then afterwards, I believe what they did was they took all the same principles that they had been employing through the Inquisition, but now they removed references to God and the church, adopted human reason, the powers of reason, that man of himself will now make decisions about right and wrong entirely without God and the church, so that they would have a weapon to use not only against Protestantism, but now against their fellow Catholics and against Catholic countries that refuse to submit to their agenda. And so it's a twofold weapon once these Marxist elements come in. And you look at what happened. They were abolished in 1773 by the Pope. They poisoned the Pope a year later, reportedly. And then by 1789, the French Revolution was launched. Many people trace the French Revolution to the University of Ingolstadt in Bavaria. That was a Jesuit university. And it would appear that the French Revolution, France had been a Catholic country. It was called the glory of old Europe. And here they went in and they utterly destroyed old France, overthrew the Catholic monarchs, had their heads cut off. And there are some who believe this was done as revenge against the papacy and against Catholics themselves, because they had resisted the Jesuit agenda, had resisted them. And then from there, they develop it with Luigi Tapparelli in 1843, who comes in with the ideas of social justice. And then with Karl Marx, 1848, he publishes the Communist Manifesto. And by 1881, we have this warning from J.A. Wylie about the Jesuits using communism as a weapon against countries they're trying to control. I believe they were using it as a weapon against both Protestant and Catholic countries. Talking about a lot of the revolutionary activities, really kind of the beginnings of a lot of these revolutionary activities. I generally believe that a lot of the activities that the Jesuits were up to, and we talked about how they were suspected in countries like Germany, Spain, etc., where they were expelled. And as I said before on disc 1, I think a lot of the reason had to do with what others believed was their relationship with Karl Marx and the rise of socialism. And we talked about that. Marx admitted it in the Chicago Tribune in an interview that he did. And this was something that was very boldly asserted by Otto von Bismarck in the German newspapers back in the 19th century. And he obviously took it seriously because, as we said before, he expelled the Jesuits from Germany during his time in power. It is worth mentioning something that's actually very well known among those who study Karl Marx and his history, is that when he was a young man, he spent 5 years being educated at a Jesuit school. And here's a quote from a website called Biography that features Karl Marx, and it says, quote, "Marx was an average student. He was educated at home until he was 12 and spent 5 years from 1830 to 1835 at the Jesuit High School in Trier, at that time known as the Friedrich Wilhelm Gymnasium. The school's principal, a friend of Marx's father, was a liberal and a Kantian, and was respected by the people of Rhineland, but was suspect to the authorities. The school was under surveillance and was raided in 1832. So you can see here's another example of an institution associated with the Jesuit order that's suspected by the state for some reason, for some kind of subversive activities, and it's raided at some point. This was a pattern, apparently, in the 19th century. If you read a whole different collection of historic references, you'll see that the Jesuits were continually suspected of some kind of subversive activity during that time, especially all the way into the 20th century. But I believe what they were doing is, by developing their ideas of what would eventually become Marxism, they were laying the groundwork in the 19th century for the great communist revolutions that would happen in the 20th century. That's generally how I perceive what they were doing. But here you see with Marx's education when he was a younger man, that he's going to the school associated with the Jesuit order. This would be an obvious connection that somebody like Otto von Bismarck many years later would look to and see a connection with the Society of Jesus and the Jesuit general that we talked about earlier. But those connections were there. They were perceived through the 19th century. As we talked about, J.A. Wylie openly stated that he believed the Jesuits were in union with communism and would use it as a weapon against countries that refused to do the bidding of the Pope. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of time to review Friedrich Engels, who was the co-author of the Communist Manifesto with Karl Marx. But who was Engels, and why is he significant? Now, he's obviously significant because he worked with Marx, but he himself was a writer, and he expounded a lot of all of these revolutionary Marxist anti-God ideas, very anti-Christian ideas. And one of the things that he wrote about was the Peasants' Revolt in the Middle Ages during the time of Martin Luther and the beginnings of the Great Reformation. Now, I see the Peasants' Revolt as a counterfeit Reformation. It was launched by people who had a very, very radical agenda, and that agenda, while it initially masqueraded itself as wanting to promote the gospel and Christianity and this kind of thing, once you examine what they eventually came to believe, it was an outright rebellion against God and all forms of government. And the reason it's significant is because Engels points to it as an early form of socialism and communism. Now, the leader of the Peasants' Revolt of 1525 was a man, a Catholic priest actually, named Thomas Münster. Thomas Münster. And Münster was associated with Martin Luther and others of the Reform era. They were Catholic priests. They were talking about problems within the Catholic Church together, etc. 1517, you have Luther, who posts his 95 Thesis, etc., and all of the controversy begins there. But then you had Münster. He had his own view. His view, according to Engels in his book on the Peasants' War, he has a book on it which you can find online where he talks about all of this. But the difference between Luther and Münster was that Luther believed in a strict adherence to the Bible, to the Scriptures as the Word of God. Münster did not. And I'm basing this now, just so we understand, this is all based on the historic data given by Friedrich Engels in his work on this, where he talks about Thomas Münster. In general, he favored Münster and not Luther. He favored Münster and not Luther, just so we understand. So at one point he says, quote, already in the spring of 1524, in a letter to Melanchthon, that model of a hectic stay-at-home Philistine, Münster wrote that he and Luther did not understand the movement at all. They were seeking, he said, to choke it by adherence to the letter of the Bible, and their doctrine was worm-eaten. Okay? So Münster had this completely different idea. And notice the criticism there. that he says to Luther and Melanchthon, who were both Reformed teachers who believed in sola scriptura, ultimately, that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, as the Scripture says. But Munzer saw this approach as supposedly choking the movement. And the reason is because he had a completely different idea of what the movement was supposed to be. And his idea became very, very materialistic, not concerned with the salvation of the souls of men, but rather the kind of economic and property issues that you see in Marxism later on. Now, I want to give you some quotes here from this work by Engels. And he's talking about Munzer and so on. He says, quote, Munzer at that time was still a theologian before everything else. He directed his attacks almost exclusively against the priests. He did not, however, preach quiet debate and peaceful progress as Luther had begun to do at that time. But he continued the early, violent preachments of Luther, appealing to the princes of Saxony and the people to rise in arms against the Roman priests. Luther did apparently early on have a quote about taking up arms against the Roman priesthood because of the injustices they were guilty of. But then what Luther did was he sort of calmed himself down, apparently, according to Engels, and took a more bold theological approach and a political approach, but it was not really given to violence and revolution, that kind of thing. Munzer, however, he focused on the revolution. Munzer said, quote, Is it not Christ who said, I have come to bring not peace, but the sword? What can you do with that sword? You can only do one thing. If you wish to be the servants of God, you must drive out and destroy the evil ones who stand in the way of the gospel. Christ ordered very earnestly, quote, But these mine enemies that would not that I should reign over them, bring hither and slay them before me. He's quoting from the Gospel of Luke. He's actually quoting from Luke chapter 19 and verse 27, the parable of the pounds. The parable of the pounds, where each of the servants is given a different number of pounds, and then when the king returns, then all of his servants give an account. And he deals with each of the servants, etc. And then he says, after he's rewarded his servants and dealt with the one wicked servant who did nothing with his pound, then he says in verse 27, But those mine enemies which would not that I should reign over them, bring hither and slay them before me. Now, most believers understand that when the Lord returns at the second coming of Christ, that yes, there will be that day of judgment. And I think most Christian teachers relate those verses to Judgment Day at the return of the Lord. However, Munzer applied this to the temporal realm right now. And why? Why did he do that? Well, Engels tells us. He says that Munzer's, quote, theologic, philosophic doctrine attacked all the main points, not only of Catholicism, but of Christianity. And says, under the cloak of Christian forms, he preached a kind of pantheism, which curiously resembles the modern speculative mode of contemplation, and at times even taught open atheism. He says that he, meaning Munzer, repudiated the assertion that the Bible was the only infallible revelation. The only living revelation, he said, was reason, a revelation which existed among all peoples at all times. Faith, he said, was nothing else but reason come alive in man. Therefore, he said, pagans could also have faith. Through this faith, through reason come to life, man became godlike and blessed, he said. Heaven was to be sought in this life, not beyond, and it was, according to Munzer, the task of the believers to establish heaven, the kingdom of God, here on earth. As there is no heaven in the beyond, so there is no hell in the beyond, and no damnation, and there are no devils, but the evil desires and cravings of man. Okay, so you can see just from that. Now, this is all according to Engels' interpretation of Munzer. So Munzer is clearly not walking after the reformers, men like Luther and later Calvin, etc. Not at all. In fact, what he's doing is he is laying the groundwork, I believe, for what would become the rationalist movement that the Jesuits would teach, and that would become the driving philosophy behind the French Revolution and eventually evolve into socialism and communism, along with social justice, even before, which we're going to talk about here soon. But notice Munzer was really moving completely away from the Protestant Reformation. He admired the radical aspects of Luther and those who were driving the Reformation, but he wanted to take it a different way. Now, I have believed for years that the Jesuits spent a long time studying the great Protestant Reformation and have imitated elements of it that they thought were effective and useful. But I think at this point in history, there's no question that they threw their hat in the ring with Munzer, as it were, because they've effectively adopted his philosophies in many ways. You think about things like these references here to pantheism. Pantheism is the idea that all of the gods are one and the same, based on the pantheon in Rome, which was the house of all the gods. So pantheism is the idea that all gods are somehow or other co-equal, or they're one and the same thing, to that effect. And then Engels tells us that at points, Munzer even promoted atheism, outright atheism. Look at what the Vatican has been doing since Pope Francis, the first Jesuit pope, took office. We had Pope Francis making references to how atheists perhaps can even go to heaven, words to that effect. And the Vatican has released this video some time ago where they have a Catholic priest, they have a Muslim, they have a Buddhist, they have an Orthodox Jew, and so on, and they're all standing there, and the Vatican video basically says that all of these different belief systems are essentially one and the same. And it's just another manifestation of what we had seen with Pope John Paul II back in 1986, when he met with all these leaders of different religious groups and effectively said, we're all praying to the same God. That's pantheism. And so we find these elements all the way back here at the time of the Reformation, at the time of Thomas Munzer. Munzer is promoting a lot of these radical ideas, and of course his ideas lead to this very radical, violent revolution. Very radical and very violent. You find the elements, essentially, of pure Marxism and communism. And this is what Engels is referring to here. That he's basically saying that Munzer was an early communist. Here's what he says. He says a couple of things that are interesting that we find, I think, with the Jesuits later on. He says, quote, Munzer preached these doctrines mostly in a covert fashion under the cloak of Christian phraseology. In other words, while outwardly using Christian phrases and this kind of thing, inwardly he had a very different agenda. He says, as Munzer's philosophy of religion touched upon atheism, so his political program touched upon communism. All right, he goes on to talk about how Munzer insisted that the original Christianity was very different than what we find in the Bible, obviously. He says, quote, by the kingdom of God, Munzer understood nothing else than a state of society without class differences, without private property, and without superimposed state powers opposed to the members of society. All existing authorities, as far as they did not submit and join the revolution, he taught, must be overthrown. All work and all property must be shared in common, and complete equality must be introduced. And remember, that is the incessant claim of Marxism, that everything must be made equal. And of course, if we listen to their equality arguments long enough, we realize they're not really after equality, because they come up with all these unequal standards that they insist upon. But what it is an excuse to go in, accuse the established order of inequality and then to use that as a weapon to seize power, to basically say, okay, you're being unequal, so we have to equalize things. We're going to seize power and control, and then we'll make everything equal once we're in charge. That's basically what communism and socialism does anywhere that they're able to seize control. So Munzer now, remember, he was a Catholic priest. He was operating on certain principles, which we're going to learn here soon, actually precede him. Go back to Thomas Aquinas and others in Catholic history, Catholic philosophies from the Middle Ages. But he's employing those philosophies now in a full-blown heretical manner, focusing on the temporal realm. He's even now gotten rid of the idea of heaven and hell, etc. He's embracing the idea of many gods through pantheism, even promoting atheism. This is really the blend that you find in modern Marxism. And I believe he ultimately would influence. I think the Jesuits studied him later on and adopted many of his ideas and developed them, because he was a radical and he was ultimately opposed to Luther and the Reformation. Now, here, according to Engels, he goes on to talk about this conflict with Luther. I also want to make reference here briefly to an article by Dr. Peter Hammond, who wrote about this. His article is called "Were the Anabaptists Persecuted for Their Faith?" And it has to do with the fact that for a time, Munzer was joined by certain radical Anabaptists who were known for being very violent and so on. And just on a side note, there were, yes, peace-loving Anabaptists. That's true, but there were very radical and even violent Anabaptists. Those are the ones Dr. Hammond is referring to in his article. But in this article, he makes reference to a book by an author named Igor Shafarevich, and the book is called The Socialist Phenomena, that documents the teachings and activities of the Anabaptist leaders. In fact, Thomas Munzer is called in this article an Anabaptist leader. And Engels documents how he joined up with the Anabaptists, a radical arm of them. Anyway, at one point, he said to Luther, he said, quote, "I would like to smell your frying carcass." What he said to Luther at one point. Just to show you the kind of radical mentality of Munzer and many of his followers. But now here's a quote from the work by Engels, where Engels talks about the conflict between Luther and Munzer. He says, quote, "Luther openly denounced Munzer. In his letter to the princes of Saxony against the rebellious spirit, he declared Munzer to be an instrument of Satan and demanded of the princes to intervene and drive the instigators of the upheaval out of the country, since, he said, they did not confine themselves to preaching their evil doctrine, but incited to insurrection, to violent lawless action against the authorities." End quote. Now think about that. Think about what's going on in our country today. We not only have these radical Marxists that are running around with their evil doctrines, as it were, but now they've begun to incite people to insurrection and lawless action. More and more, we're seeing the smashing, the burning, the rioting. Now you had the guy who got a rifle and went and started shooting at Republican politicians while they were playing baseball. You've had more and more the promotion of violence by the left in our country, but it's following the same pattern that was set in motion, set in place really by Munzer all the way back, in contrast to the Reformed Protestant movement. Another contrast, you look at the American Revolution. The American Revolution operated on Reformed Protestant principles that Samuel Adams called political Protestantism, but then you had the French Revolution that came afterwards, and it operated very much on the principles of Munzer. And the French revolutionaries even exalted the whole concept of reason, just as Munzer did. In fact, they took a prostitute, a female prostitute, put her on a throne, and then lifted her up in the air, and they would carry her around the city, declaring that reason was their goddess. And really it was a symbol for human reason. That human reason will now stand in place of God, or be in place of God. This was the symbolism of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the whole idea of Dr. Frankenstein. He's going to play the creator now, and he's going to come up with his own creature. Man replaces God. And that's effectively what Marxism and communism is. It's man now casting aside God, casting aside God's commands, and saying man's authority will now stand in place of God's authority. And that's what we're watching happen in much of the Western world. God's authority has been pushed aside, even though the historically Christian countries of the Western world were once based on the authority of God. But now it has begun to shift and change. That's what we're seeing. And Marxism is at the heart of it. There's no question about that. We've got to remember the scriptures, brethren. Romans chapter 3 and verse 4, which says, "Let God be true, but every man a liar." Let God be true, but every man a liar. In Mark chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus said, "There is none good but one, that is God. God alone is truly good." And when Jesus talked to the people, he said in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 11, he said, "If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your Father which is in heaven give good things to them that ask him?" So notice Jesus acknowledged that the people of themselves, man, is evil by nature. Man's nature is in opposition to God. God alone is good. Man is evil. And so the Apostle Paul says in Romans chapter 9 and verse 20, "Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God?" Man does not have any authority to argue against the Lord. That was the view, ultimately, of Luther and the Reformers, the Reformation. But notice, from that same time, you had a different view, this view of Munzer, that would also become the view of the Marxists in the 19th and 20th century, and that is that man really is his own God. Man is his own authority based upon his own powers of reasoning, whatever they may be. All right, so to finish our discussion on Thomas Munzer. Thomas Munzer ultimately was overthrown. The whole Peasants' War was overthrown. It was a very, very bloody ordeal, according to the historic records. And the peasants themselves were just, even though they were armed for battle, I mean, there's no question, they took up arms. They were out to fight, but they were just slaughtered. They were slaughtered because they were no match for the experienced armies. I personally find it very interesting when you compare this godless rebellion, ultimately, with men of faith, men like in the Hussite Wars, where you had Jan Žižka, who was a Christian man, a God-fearing Christian man, a follower of the teachings of Jan Hus, the one-eyed general. Žižka was the one-eyed general, but he was a Hussite. And when Jan Hus was burnt at the stake, and then the Holy Roman Emperor tried to invade Bohemia because of the uprising that happened, Žižka went out with really a band of farmers. These were not experienced soldiers at all. They didn't even have professional weapons at first. They got them eventually. But you read the history from J.A. Wylie, and they were victorious. They ultimately prevailed against their enemies. They are said to have fought a total of 16 battles, and they won every time. Okay? You compare this with Oliver Cromwell, then in the 17th century, a man who had no military experience at all, but he had faith in God, just like Žižka. He had faith in God, believed the word of God. believed he was doing God's work. He was convicted and believed God's promises of victory in battle if he would obey the commandments of God. And Cromwell was at a serious disadvantage. But he claimed victory after victory and ultimately was undefeated. I saw a documentary, in fact, on Cromwell not long ago, and one of the commentators, who was a historian over there in the UK, pointed out that Cromwell modeled what he was doing after Gideon in the book of Judges. And he believed that, like Gideon, he was being sent forth by God to do what he did. And he was undefeated. It's an interesting contrast. I've always thought it was very, very powerful. But with Munster was overthrown in 1525, and he was captured and eventually executed for treason. And so his movement came to an end. But the memory of what he did and what he was teaching and writing about and this kind of thing, it lingered on. The Jesuits would be formed now. Munster is killed in 1525. The Jesuits are formed in 1540, or I should say they were actually formed earlier, but they were commissioned by the Pope in 1540 to launch the Counter-Reformation. And it seems apparent that the Jesuits studied what Munster did and what he taught and this kind of thing, because they would adopt many of these teachings, and then the socialists and the communists adopted them in the 19th century. This is why Frederick Engels is writing about them. But the question is, where did Munster get these ideas? Remember, he was a Catholic priest now. He was an ordained Catholic priest. And so it stands to reason he would have been taught Catholic philosophy. He would have been taught about Catholic scholars like Thomas Aquinas and others. Because the question comes in, where did he get these ideas about private property ownership? Now, this is where I'm going to recommend a book called Ecclesiastical Megalomania, The Economic and Political Thought of the Roman Catholic Church by John W. Robbins. John W. Robbins. This book, if you want to understand the influence of Marxism and communism and the Roman Catholic Church in modern times, if you want a lot of detailed information about that, then Robbins' book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, that is definitely the book to read. It's a great book, lots of detailed information. But Robbins begins, when he's talking about the relationship with Rome and Marxism and so on, he begins by talking about private property. Private property, the issue of private property. That's the very first thing. Because the abolishment of private property, that's the very foundation of communism and socialism. That you abolish private property ownership, and then the state, or the church, in the case of the Roman Catholic Church, but the state effectively assumes the authority over all property. Now nothing belongs to any private citizen. Everything is community goods and is to be distributed according to whatever the governing powers think is best, not according to the individual. So individual rights, individual property are effectively abolished. All power is channeled to the state, and then they control everything. That's how a pure, full-blown communist society will operate. But here's what Robbins says at one point, here early on in the book. He says, quote, "To understand how the economic thought of the Roman church state spawned these anti-capitalist systems." He gives a list of anti-capitalist systems. Feudalism, fascism, Nazism, interventionism, and then liberation theology, which we're going to talk about here, especially as it pertains to the Jesuits, because they are the authors of liberation theology. But he says to understand how the economic thought of the Roman church state, he says, spawned these anti-capitalist systems, we begin with Thomas Aquinas' discussion of private property. Private property is the central economic institution of civilized societies, and it is the Roman church state's rejection of private property that contributed to the establishment of several varieties of destructive anti-capitalism throughout the world. Okay, so let's stop there for just a moment. Notice what he says. The Roman church state rejected the idea of private property ownership. Ultimately, Rome believed that all property should be in her hands. Ultimately, it's very interesting when the Puritans and the Pilgrims founded the early colonies. One of the early American mottos was life, liberty, and property. Private property ownership was seen as an essential component for freedom. Because if you don't own anything, if nothing belongs to you personally, how can you be free? If you've always got to look to somebody else to get permission for what you're doing on someone else's land or in someone else's home or whatever, you can't really be free. And our forefathers understood this, and they had seen it by and large because of the condition of the old world in Europe. And the reason that condition existed was because of the influence of the Church of Rome through the Middle Ages, through the Holy Roman Empire, which was influenced, of course, in part by Thomas Aquinas. Now, here's what John Robbins says in his book about Aquinas. He says, quote, "Private property, according to Thomas, is neither part of the natural law nor an absolute right, but an invention of human reason." Now, the reason we disagree with that, the idea that it's not part of natural law or an absolute right or a right, and so on, the reason we would disagree with that biblically, if you just read the scriptures in the Old Testament in Genesis, you have Abraham who purchases a plot of land from the sons of Heth. He pays 400 shekels for a piece of land from the sons of Heth. And we read about this in Genesis chapter 23. It says, spake unto the sons of Heth in verse 3, but then you skip down, and in verse 13 it says, "And he spake unto Ephron in the audience of the people of the land, saying, But if thou wilt give it, I pray thee, hear me, I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I will bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying unto him, My Lord, hearken unto me, the land is worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that betwixt me and thee? Bury therefore thy dead." Now, prior to that, Ephron offered to give Abraham the land for free. He was just going to tell him, take the land, whatever land you want, that's okay. But Abraham insisted on paying for the land. Abraham did not want to receive the land for free. Probably, and who knows, the scripture doesn't tell us why, but my point is this. It was very clear, and it was the understanding of the people. Remember now, Abraham is one of the descendants of Noah and his family. Here now, generations after the flood, very clearly, as people spread out throughout the earth, they had a sense of private property ownership. Somebody owns that piece of land. And Abraham did not have the idea that he could just go take it, or that he was entitled to it, or something, but he has the very strong sense. Remember now, Abraham is a godly man, walks in the fear of God. But it was very clearly his understanding. Now, it was clearly his understanding that this property was owned by somebody else and he needs to pay for it. Even though they offered it for free, for whatever reason, Abraham wanted to make sure he paid for it, which he does. He pays 400 shekels of silver, and that's where he ends up burying his wife Sarah. But my point is this. The reason I think this is important is because this is the earliest record of civilization that we have after the flood of Noah. And it's very clear that they understood that there were boundaries for property. Certain people owned certain plots of land. And certainly it was not thought, as Thomas Aquinas says, that somehow or other all land was owned by everybody and that there were no boundaries or something like that. That was clearly not the understanding. But again, the problem with the Church of Rome is that the Church of Rome historically does not base its understanding on the Scriptures, but rather quite often on human philosophy and human ideology. All right, so Robbins gives another example. He's writing about further about Aquinas' ideas. He says, quote, because the goods of some are due to others by the natural law, there is no sin if the poor take the goods of their neighbors. Thomas wrote, quote, in cases of need, all things are common property, so that there would seem to be no sin in taking another's property, for need has made it common. Then Robbins says, not only is such taking of another's property not a sin, it is not even a crime. According to Thomas, quote, it is lawful for a man to succor his own need by means of another's property, by taking it either openly or secretly. Nor is this, properly speaking, theft and robbery. It is not theft, properly speaking, to take secretly and use another's property in a case of extreme need, because that which he takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of that need. In a case of a like need, a man may also take secretly another's property in order to succor his neighbor in need. So now, not only can you steal for your own need, you can steal also if your neighbor is in need. Now you can see kind of the beginnings of the whole concept of redistribution of wealth that is practiced in socialism and communism. Because a communist leader, a socialist leader, can say, well, my neighbor, these people over here, they have need. So therefore then, that justifies going and taking from this person or that group over there and redistributing their wealth over to somebody else. See, this was the thinking of Thomas Aquinas. Clearly, his thinking was not governed by the understanding of God's command, which is, thou shalt not steal, which is very, very clear. Also, where land is concerned, because, and very interesting, the whole idea of land and property rights, etc., that is not just in terms of monetarily and so on, but literally land possessions. That is a key part of the whole communist argument. We're seeing it right now with the globalists who are arguing for open borders. That's a purely communist argument, to say that nobody has any right to have any borders or boundaries, and people who want to go into a country somewhere have a right somehow or other to do so. That's the whole open borders philosophy. Nevertheless, Deuteronomy 27 and verse 17 says specifically, cursed be he that removeth his neighbor's landmark. And all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed be he that removeth his neighbor's landmark. It's specifically a reference to an ancient practice where you would have some kind of marking stone or something or other that would mark the boundaries of a piece of land, and then somebody would come in, typically secretly, and move that landmark so they could take part of your land. That was the purpose for doing it. But very clearly here in the scripture, in Deuteronomy, God's law is acknowledging property ownership, private property ownership. Somebody owns the land, and you don't have the right to steal it in some kind of secret way, or I guess in any way. It's very, very clear. We find it in God's law. We find the principle of private property in the Old Testament over and over again. Now, in contrast, here's what Robbins tells us about Thomas Aquinas' idea of property. He says, quote, in Thomas's philosophy, need is the moral criterion for the rightful and lawful possession of property. Whoever needs property ought to possess it. Need makes another's goods one's own. Need is the ultimate and only moral title to property. Neither possession, nor creation, nor production, nor gift, nor inheritance, nor divine commandment, with the exception of Roman Church state property, grants title to property that is immune to the prior claim of need. So in other words, if somebody can say that they need property, then they ought to be able to take it whether somebody else owns it or not. And of course, these ideas were all based in the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas, who's declared a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Aquinas, it's important to understand, Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, a member of the Dominican order, and the Dominicans were ultimately the founders of the Inquisition. We show this in our film, A Lamp in the Dark, The Untold History of the Bible, how Dominic Guzman, he was the one who debated with Bible believers in the Middle Ages. They refused to submit to the authority of the Pope, and so he threatened them with slavery, imprisonment, and death. And he goes back and he gets with Pope Innocent III and Simon de Montfort, and they raise up an army and they launch this crusade to put a stop to the so-called heresies of these Bible believers. And that was the beginning of the Great Inquisition. And Dominic, his priesthood, his followers and disciples and so on, became known as the Dominicans. And so one of the, probably one of the most famous Dominicans ever, was Thomas Aquinas, who achieved sainthood. But the Dominicans, if you study them, they employed these teachings of Thomas Aquinas, and they would confiscate land, they would confiscate property from heretics. This was one of the things that they did. Here is, I'm just going to read a brief quote from a work titled, "Can I Join the Church of Rome While My Rule of Faith is the Bible? An inquiry presented to the conscience of the Christian reader." And this was published back in 1844. And so it gives historic data on the history of the Church of Rome and to some extent the Inquisition. Anyway, at one point, talks about Torquemada, probably one of the most notorious Grand Inquisitors. And it says, at one point it says, quote, "Torquemada, tormented by gout, resigned his office and, dying in 1498, was buried in the Dominican convent of Avila, which, founded with the confiscated property of heretics, was, strictly speaking, a monument of his cruel activity." So this, back in 1844, a view of the Dominicans and, of course, their cruel activity. And where's he buried? A convent in Avila that had been taken, confiscated property of heretics. Because if you go study the Dominicans, that was one of the instruments that they used. If they could accuse somebody of heresy, then they could go and confiscate their property. But it all seems to have been based in the teachings of Thomas Aquinas. Now, what's interesting, let's fast forward now out of the Middle Ages into the 19th century, and we come to a Jesuit priest by the name of Monsignor Luigi Tapparelli. Luigi Tapparelli, who in 1843 was the first man to coin the phrase social justice. Social justice. Now, obviously, that phrase is very, very common today. It's employed all the time in colleges, universities. We hear it on the news continually, and the whole concept of social justice. And there's no question that social justice is really kind of an entry doctrine for Marxism, socialism, and communism. In fact, as I understand it, the three stages you have are social justice is the beginning, socialism is the middle, and communism, full-blown communism, is the end. That's the conclusion of the Marxist ideology. Now, if you were to go to Wikipedia and look up Luigi Tapparelli, T-A-P-A-R-E-L-L-I, you'll read there in the second paragraph, it says, quote, "In 1825, he became convinced that the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas needed to be revived." Thomas Aquinas. So, his whole idea of social justice really is based upon these same ideas of Thomas Aquinas. All right, now this is from I'm going to read a quote here from a website called Ave Maria University. Ave Maria University, a Catholic website. And it says, writing about Luigi Tapparelli, says, quote, "Tapparelli was also a key figure in the Italian Thomistic revival, a movement in which La Civiltà Cattolica too was instrumental. Aquinas was an essential guide for Taparelli in the composition of the Saggio. Quote, "To make sure that I had not erred," Taparelli explains in a letter, "as my theories were born, I compared them with St. Thomas. He was the touchstone." End quote. And of course, in 1843, Taparelli coined the phrase social justice. That's 1843. Remember, Karl Marx then publishes the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Now, to see a very practical application of this in modern times, something that most people listening to this audio CD will be able to relate to, consider the whole controversy with illegal immigration coming up from Mexico. If you get the book, American Democracy and the Vatican by Dr. Stephen Mumford, Dr. Mumford asserts and presents a lot of evidence that the whole problem with illegal immigration is the Vatican's involvement in American politics, and that they have, through their manipulations for decades now, going back to the Reagan era, if not sooner, but through their manipulations, they have prevented the United States government from coming up with any effective plan to actually stop illegal immigration, because 90% of the illegals coming in are Catholics from Mexico. And the Vatican wants to build up the Catholic population in America. And so using this Thomas Aquinas argumentation, the Mexican people supposedly need this land. They need to come here, supposedly. So it doesn't matter if they have to break the law to get here. And it doesn't matter if the people of America own this land. That doesn't matter. All of that is swept aside because of this alleged need that they have to be here. This is a very practical, modern manifestation of this whole argument. To show you a step further, many people will remember, of course, Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, at one point in one of his writings, quoted from Vatican Council II, in which he said, here's what Pope John Paul II said. He said, quote, "God intended the earth with everything contained in it for the use of all human beings and peoples. If one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others." In fact, there's a number of declarations in Vatican Council II. We're not going to go over all of them. But Vatican II was largely written by the Jesuit order and instigated by them. There's no question. And I find it very interesting. Here is a quote from Pope Paul VI, who in 1967, his 1967 encyclical, remember Vatican II was 1960 to 1965. So in 1967, Paul VI writes on the progress of peoples. That's the name of his encyclical. And he says, quote, "Each man has therefore the right to find in the world what is necessary for himself. The recent Council, Vatican II, reminded us of this. God intended the earth and all that it contains for the use of every human being and people. Thus, as all men follow justice and unite in charity, created goods should abound for them on a reasonable basis. All other rights whatsoever, including those of property and of free commerce, are to be subordinated to this principle." Now, personally, I believe, and I've said this before on my radio program at noiseofthunderradio.com, that the Jesuits in Vatican Council II, where this is called the Ecumenical Council, where they basically made the argument that all religions effectively, all the major religions anyway, effectively believe the same thing, especially Islam, that the Muslims essentially worship the same God as Catholics and by extension Christian evangelicals, based on the wording in Vatican II. And then with this, you have this idea that property rights, the idea of your private property, needs to be in submission to whether or not somebody needs something. Now think about that in terms of what began happening by the late 1960s, where you had 50,000 immigrants that were pouring into Western Europe. And then Enoch Powell, with his Rivers of Blood speech in 1968, is warning about this, that this is going to create problems. But then it just gets worse, on and on and on. But what's been the driving argument? The driving argument is that all these people, all these immigrants, they effectively believe the same thing as we do, whatever it is, because Christianity's no better than Islam or anything else. And if they have a need to come into your country, then the idea that country is your private property, no, it isn't. Their need is more important than your property line, your boundary line, your border. This is where the whole philosophy, I believe, began post-World War II to impose this massive wave of immigrants on the Western world. But it's all happening based on these Marxist principles. Now, I wanted to cover one more thing from this book by John Robbins, Ecclesiastical Megalomania. In chapter 3, he talks about an encyclical titled Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum. He says, quote, "One of the Roman Church state's most influential statements on economic matters is the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum on the condition of the working classes. In this encyclical, the Roman Church state allied herself with the proletariat, which in Marxism is the great and final enemy of the capitalist order. The encyclical's Marxism is so blatant that one Roman Catholic writer declared that, quote, much of the encyclical, Rerum Novarum, appeared only to repeat in more orthodox language what Marx had said 10 years before." Das Kapital, Karl Marx's work, Das Kapital, had been published in 1881. 1881. Now why? Why would you find that in a papal encyclical at that point? Why? Because the Jesuits had taken control of the Vatican by the middle to the probably by the middle of the 19th century. After they were reinstated in 1814 and 15, they gained control of the Vatican. They became the chief influence there. You have all of these statements being made. I mean, there's a statement even from Fenton John Anthony Hort. At one point, he makes reference to the Pope, and he says, well, the Pope may do this if the Jesuits will let him. That's the comment you get from Hort. So my point is, the understanding was by the late 19th century that the Jesuits were in control of the Vatican and that they manipulated the papacy. And what do we find? We find this declaration that sounds like it could have come from Marx's own work, Das Kapital. Das Kapital. Also, interestingly, on page 44 of this book, Robbins says, quote, "Indeed, there are paragraphs, if not pages, in the Communist Manifesto that might have been written by the Pope." That might have been written by the Pope. And really what that means is they might have been written by the Jesuit order. That's really what that means, because the papacy, if you study the papacy, the popes don't just sit down and write these encyclicals and declarations and things like that. They have counselors who sit there, and who are those counselors and advisors? Right up into modern times, it is the Jesuit order. Now, I want to read another quote here. I thought it was going to be the last quote, but I've got one more here that I want to read because I want to give you some idea of how Marxism, with the Vatican, the Jesuits, the Church of Rome overall, impacts the world that we live in even today. Now, with this in mind, let me read this quote. This is from Robbins. Robbins begins by talking about a Newsweek article and a column by a journalist named Joe Klein back in 1996, who talks about the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in American politics. And he says this, he quotes Klein, but then this is Robbins' analysis, just so we understand. He says, quote, following Vatican directives, Roman Catholic politicians, legislators, and intellectuals brought us the progressive movement, the labor union movement, the graduated income tax, the New Deal, FDR's New Deal, and the growth of government in the United States. The growth of government was not only in the United States, of course, perhaps the United States because it is the nation in which biblical Christianity had the most impact, is also the country where the least growth of government has occurred. In other nations in which Roman Catholic influence was greater, governments became even more socialist than they did in the United States. In Italy, for example, an overwhelmingly Roman Catholic country, the Communist Party was once the largest communist party in the world outside the Soviet Union and China. Now, not many people are aware, not many people are aware of the relationship of communism and the Church of Rome. Now, also, there is a contrast that's drawn between the Roman Catholic approach to a country and economy and things like that versus the Reformed Protestant approach. This was even noted by a British socialist named R.H. Tawney. R.H. Tawney, who argued that, quote, capitalism was the social counterpart of Calvinist theology. Historically, the view is that capitalism and Reformed teaching, Protestant Reformation theology and worldview, that capitalism and Protestantism are essentially hand in glove. That's the idea. And so this British socialist named Tawney, at one point, he said, quote, by the middle of the 17th century, the contrast between the social conservatism of Catholic Europe and the strenuous enterprise of Calvinist communities had become a commonplace. There is a kind of natural inaptness, wrote a pamphleteer in 1671, in the popish religion to business, whereas, on the contrary, among the Reformed, the greater their zeal, the greater their inclination to trade and industry as holding idleness unlawful. In other words, the Reformers believed to be idle was unlawful. Why? Because God says, if any man will not work, neither should he eat. And this is declared in both the Old Testament and the New. So the quote goes on, he says, quote, the influence of Calvinism was frequently adduced as one explanation of the economic prosperity of Holland. Then we have a quote from Thomas Babington Macaulay in his History of England, where he effectively says something very similar. He says, quote, whoever passes in Germany from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant principality, in Switzerland from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant canton, in Ireland from a Roman Catholic to a Protestant country, finds that he has passed from a lower to a higher grade of civilization. On the other side of the Atlantic, the same law prevails. The Protestants of the United States have left far behind the Roman Catholics of Mexico, Peru, and Brazil. And that was published in 1889. 1889. All right, then we have a quote in 1845 from Charles Dickens, the very famous Charles Dickens, the writer, author of The Christmas Carol, etc. And he wrote to a man named Mr. Foster. He said this, he said, quote, in the Simplon at the bridge of St. Maurice, where the Protestant canton ends and a Catholic canton begins, you might separate two perfectly distinct and different conditions of humanity by drawing a line with your stick in the dust on the ground. On the Protestant side, neatness, cheerfulness, industry, education, continued aspiration after better things. On the Catholic side, dirt, disease, ignorance, squalor, and misery. Then it says in 1846, Dickens wrote, quote, "If I were a Swiss with 100,000 pounds, I would be as steady against the Catholic canons and the propagation of Jesuitism as any radical among them, believing the dissemination of Catholicity to be the most horrible means of political and social degradation left in the world." End quote. Charles Dickens. All right, now having discussed all of this history about the Jesuits, Marxism, the Counter-Reformation, the origins of social justice with the Jesuit Taparelli, and then combining Thomas Aquinas, and really that's the very foundation of Marxism itself. The whole concept of redistributing wealth, etc., and destroying private property ownership. But what is at the core of this, brethren? I believe what's at the heart of all of the Marxist ideology, what we're seeing day in and day out, and it's really taken hold in our schools and colleges and universities, but what's at the heart of it with the class warfare is a violation of the 10th command, where God says, "Thou shalt not covet." Thou shalt not covet. And we're warned about what would happen in the last days where covetousness is concerned. We're going to talk about what the scriptures say about covetousness. But first I want to start with 2 Peter chapter 2, where it talks about false teachers that would rise up. And Peter says in verse 10, 2 Peter 2:10, he says, quote, "But chiefly them that walk after the flesh in the lust of uncleanness and despise government. Presumptuous are they, self-willed, they are not afraid to speak evil of dignities. Whereas angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusation against them before the Lord. But these, as natural brute beasts, made to be taken and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they understand not, and shall utterly perish in their own corruption, and shall receive the reward of unrighteousness, as they that count it pleasure to riot in the daytime. Spots they are and blemishes, sporting themselves with their own deceivings, while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery, and that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable souls, a heart they have exercised with covetous practices." A heart they have exercised with covetous practices. Covetousness. Micah, in the Old Testament, Micah chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. It says, "Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When morning is light, they practice it because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage." You look at how the communists have gone into countries. They've coveted the land. They wanted it for themselves. And what happens? They take them by violence. They go in, they have these revolutions. There's all kinds of bloodshed. They end up murdering millions of people ultimately, and they just take what they want. But what's driving them? Covetousness. Proverbs 27 and verse 4. "Wrath is cruel, and anger is outrageous. But who is able to stand before envy?" Who is able to stand before envy? When envy gets into a person's heart, it takes them over. The scripture says, "He that loveth silver will not be satisfied with silver." Covetousness does not satisfy. Proverbs 14:30. "A sound heart is the life of the flesh, but envy the rottenness of the bones." Envy, the rottenness of the bones. You think about people in our country who are driven by, they're arguing about all the alleged inequalities and it's unfair, and they think that they should have something that they don't have. They're entitled, and this kind of thing. Are they ever satisfied with anything? No, they become implacable because envy is as rottenness in their bones. Ephesians 5:5, where the Apostle Paul says, "For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater, hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God." So notice Paul says, "Nor covetous man who is an idolater." Covetousness is a form of idolatry. Covetousness becomes idolatry, I think, based on the collective wisdom of the Scripture, when it compels people to disobey God on behalf of an inordinate or inappropriate desire or lust. Here is an article I wanted to quote from. This is posted on a Christian website. The article is called "Class Warfare as Covetousness" by Craig Vincent Mitchell, Ph.D., and he talks about covetousness and as it pertains to Marxism. He says at one point, he says, quote, "Class warfare is not Christian. It is no more than simple coveting. The Bible emphasizes the importance of private ownership, hence the commandment, 'Do not steal,' and the commandment, 'Thou shalt not covet.' Class warfare begins with coveting and ends with stealing." He says, quote, "The Occupy Wall Street crowd talk about the 1%, the rich, and the 99%, the poor. The reality is that if you are born in and live in the USA, you are automatically in the 1%. Those who live here are many times wealthier than the majority of the people in the world. For the covetous, there is never enough. They are dissatisfied with their lot in life. Ultimately, they are dissatisfied with God and His providence. Rather than being thankful for what God has given them, they are angry with both God and man." Now, in contrast to this, the Scripture says, the Apostle Paul, in fact, tells us that godliness with contentment is great gain. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Also in Philippians chapter 4, Paul says in verse 12, "I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." All things through Christ. And isn't it interesting that the remarkable, the outstanding, perhaps undoubtedly the most disturbing feature of Marxism is that it ultimately arrives at a very militant form of atheism, rejecting the authority of God entirely. And there's no question that Marxism overall, I believe, is driven by the spirit of Antichrist. But I believe it's overcome by the preaching of the true gospel and by remembering the promises of God. In the world today, most people in the churches today are very familiar with Marxism, the variant forms of Marxism, whether it has to do with social justice, whether it has to do with socialism, whether it has to do with full-blown communism. There are variant forms of Marxist ideology at work in our country and in different parts of the world. You have some countries like China, that is a communist country. North Korea is a communist country. We all remember the Soviet Union before it fell at the end of the Cold War was, again, a full-blown communist country. Down in Cuba, Fidel Castro was a communist. All over Africa, you have communism at work. If you listen to the Christians down in South Africa today, South Africa that's been turned upside down with the anti-apartheid movement, they will tell you that communism is ultimately what undermined what was once a very thriving country in South Africa. Now the country is in decline. The Christians down there are being killed continually by the followers of Nelson Mandela,